Someone is secretly planning to push you out. But their real motive will shock you. My beloved child, listen carefully, don't skip this message, because someone in this story is quietly planning to push you out, and what makes this situation so shocking is that their real motive is not what you think. At first, it looks like betrayal. It looks like jealousy. It looks like someone deliberately trying to remove you from a place where you belong. You may notice conversations changing, invitations disappearing, messages becoming colder, and people suddenly acting differently around you. But there is another layer beneath everything you can see. Someone has been carrying a secret reason for their behavior, and when the truth finally comes out, you may realize that the person you thought was your enemy was struggling with something you never knew. Imagine waking up one morning and feeling that something has changed. Nobody says anything directly, but you can feel the atmosphere. A conversation stops when you enter the room. Someone who used to greet you warmly suddenly looks away. Plans seem to happen without you. Messages that once received immediate replies are now left unanswered. You begin asking yourself, what did I do? You replay old conversations in your head, searching for the moment when everything changed. And the more you think about it, the more convinced you become that someone is trying to push you out. But this story is not about paranoia. It is about perception. Because sometimes what looks like an attack is actually a complicated situation involving fear, insecurity, misunderstanding, and hidden emotions. Someone may indeed be trying to create distance. But their motive may not be hatred. It may be fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of being exposed. Fear of being compared to you. Fear that your presence changes the balance of something they thought they had secured. And perhaps the most surprising part is that they don't even realize how obvious their behavior has become. They think they're being subtle. They think you don't notice. They think you aren't paying attention. But you are. You notice the silence. You notice the change in energy. You notice the little comments. You notice who suddenly stopped including you. And perhaps you have been wondering whether you should confront them. Before you do, pause. Because you don't have all the information yet. There is something happening behind the scenes. Someone has been telling themselves a story about you. And that story may have very little to do with who you actually are. Maybe they believe you're taking something from them. Your position. Your attention. Your opportunities. Your connection with someone. Your influence. Your place in a group. Or even the affection of someone they secretly care about. Perhaps they see you as competition. But you never agreed to compete with them. That's what makes the situation so painful. You are simply living your life while someone else is fighting a battle in their own mind. They compare themselves to you. They measure their progress against yours. They notice when you receive attention. They notice when someone compliments you. They notice when people listen to you. And every time it happens, something inside them becomes uncomfortable. Not necessarily because they hate you. Sometimes people resent the qualities they wish they had. They see your confidence and remember their insecurity. They see your resilience and remember the times they gave up. They see people trusting you and wonder why they don't receive the same trust. They see you moving forward and become afraid that they are being left behind. That fear can turn into strange behavior. A person may begin creating distance. They may subtly discourage others from including you. They may tell people that you're too much. They may suggest that you don't belong. They may exaggerate small mistakes. They may bring up old situations that should have been forgotten. They may create an image of you that doesn't match reality. And slowly, they hope people will start believing their version. But here's the problem. Truth has a way of surviving. You don't need to fight every rumor. You don't need to chase every person who misunderstands you. You don't need to prove your worth to people determined to doubt you. Sometimes the strongest response is consistency. Let your actions speak. Let time reveal what words cannot. Because eventually, people notice patterns. They notice who creates drama. They notice who remains calm. They notice who takes responsibility. They notice who constantly needs someone else to blame. And the person trying to push you out may eventually expose themselves without you having to do anything. But there is a deeper twist. What if the person pushing you away actually believes they are protecting someone? What if they think your presence will cause pain? What if they believe you are going to hurt someone they care about? What if they misunderstood something you said? What if someone gave them incomplete information? What if they heard a story about you that was never true? Suddenly the situation changes. The villain may not be a villain. They may simply be acting on information they believe is true. And that doesn't mean their behavior is acceptable. It means understanding the motive gives you a clearer picture. Maybe someone told them, "You don't know what this person is really like." Maybe they heard something about your past. Maybe they were warned to keep you away from someone. Maybe they believe you're going to disrupt a relationship. Maybe they think you're going to take an opportunity from someone else. And perhaps they've been trying to push you out because they believe they are preventing a disaster. But the truth may be completely different. And that's where the story becomes emotional. Because eventually, the person discovers that the information they received was wrong. They discover that they misunderstood you. They realize that the person they were trying to protect never asked them to interfere. They realize that their actions caused unnecessary damage. And suddenly, they have to face you. Imagine that moment. They stand in front of you. No audience. No friends. No excuses. Just you and them. They take a breath and say, "I owe you an apology." You look at them. For what? They hesitate. For trying to push you away. Silence. You ask, "Why?" And they finally tell you, "I thought I was protecting someone." That sentence changes the entire atmosphere. Because now you're hearing the motive you never knew existed. They explain what they were told. They explain what they believed. They explain why they started behaving differently. And as they talk, you realize something. They weren't reacting to you. They were reacting to a story about you. That's an important distinction. People can make decisions based on assumptions. And assumptions can create real consequences. Maybe they misunderstood your intentions. Maybe they interpreted your silence as arrogance. Maybe they interpreted your confidence as disrespect. Maybe they interpreted your independence as rejection. Maybe they interpreted your boundaries as hostility. And perhaps nobody ever asked you what you actually meant. That is how misunderstandings grow. One person assumes. Another person reacts. A third person hears a distorted version. And suddenly everyone is fighting a conflict that never needed to exist. But perhaps the person trying to push you out discovers the truth. They discover that you were never trying to hurt anyone. You weren't trying to steal anyone's position. You weren't trying to compete. You weren't trying to destroy a relationship. You were simply trying to live your life. And that realization hits them hard. Because now they have to admit they judged you without knowing you. They have to admit they believed someone else's version of you. They have to admit that fear controlled their behavior. And perhaps that is their real motive. Fear. Not hatred. Not evil. Fear. Fear can make people behave in ways they later regret. It can make someone push away a person they actually admire. It can make someone sabotage a relationship they secretly wish they had. It can make someone reject an opportunity because they're afraid of losing control. And perhaps that's what happened here. They saw something in you that made them uncomfortable. Your presence reminded them of something they hadn't resolved within themselves. Maybe they admired you. Maybe they even wished they could be more like you. But admiration mixed with insecurity can become resentment. And resentment can become distance. That doesn't make their actions okay. But it makes the story understandable. Perhaps they were looking at you and thinking, how do they do it? How do they keep going? How do people trust them? Why does everything seem to work for them? They didn't see the nights you struggled. They didn't see the moments you cried. They didn't see the sacrifices. They didn't see the failures. They only saw the result. And they compared their private struggles to your public appearance. That comparison created a false story. Maybe they thought your life was easy. Maybe they thought you had everything handed to you. Maybe they believed you didn't deserve the opportunities you received. And slowly, jealousy began growing. But jealousy isn't always about wanting what another person has. Sometimes jealousy is grief over what someone believes they themselves don't have. That's why this story is more complicated than simple betrayal. Someone may be trying to push you out because your presence reminds them of a version of themselves they wish they could become. Your confidence reminds them of their fear. Your courage reminds them of their hesitation. Your progress reminds them of their stagnation. Your happiness reminds them of what they haven't healed. And instead of confronting those feelings, they blame you. That's the real danger of insecurity. It makes people attack the mirror instead of changing themselves. But you don't have to become their mirror. You don't have to absorb their insecurity. You don't have to accept their projection. You can simply remain grounded. Maybe they try one more time to push you out. Maybe they create another rumor. Maybe they convince someone that you're the problem. But this time, something different happens. Someone asks for proof. Someone says, "Wait. Is that actually true? And suddenly the story begins falling apart. Because rumors depend on people refusing to ask questions. Once someone asks for evidence, the entire narrative becomes weaker. And perhaps the person who started it realizes they've gone too far. Maybe they finally admit, "I don't actually know if it's true." That sentence could change everything. Because now people begin questioning what they've heard. They begin talking directly to you. And suddenly, the person they were told you were isn't the person standing in front of them. You're calm. You're honest. You're willing to explain. You don't need to attack anyone. And that contrast becomes powerful. The truth doesn't need to scream. It simply needs to remain consistent. Eventually, someone approaches you and says, "I heard something about you." You respond, "What did you hear?" They tell you. You smile sadly. "That isn't what happened." They ask, "Why didn't you tell us?" And perhaps you answer, "Because nobody asked." That sentence carries weight. Because sometimes people don't need more information. They need better communication. Maybe the entire conflict could have been avoided if someone had simply asked you. Maybe the person trying to push you out never gave you a chance to explain. And now they regret it. Perhaps your soulmate is watching this unfold too. Maybe your soulmate knew something was wrong but didn't understand the full situation. Maybe they noticed the tension. Maybe they sensed someone was uncomfortable around you. Maybe they were afraid to intervene. But eventually, they learn the truth. And when they do, their reaction is emotional. They realize you were being judged unfairly. They realize you were carrying the consequences of someone else's insecurity. And perhaps they become protective of your peace. Not possessive. Protective. They tell you, "You don't have to defend yourself to everyone. You don't have to prove yourself. I know who you are." Those words may mean more than you expect. Because when you've been misunderstood, being understood by one person can feel like breathing again. But there's another twist. Your soulmate may realize that the person trying to push you out was actually afraid of losing them. Perhaps this person believed that your connection with your soulmate was becoming too strong. Maybe they saw the bond developing. Maybe they felt excluded. Maybe they thought, "If these two become closer, where does that leave me?" And instead of admitting that fear, they tried to remove you. Suddenly the motive becomes even more personal. They weren't necessarily trying to destroy you. They were trying to protect their place. But in doing so, they created a situation that exposed their insecurity. Your soulmate may confront them. "What were you doing?" The person says, "I was trying to protect you." Your soulmate responds, "From what?" Silence. "From them?" "Yes." "Why?" "I thought they would hurt you." "And did you ever ask them?" Silence again. That is when the truth becomes impossible to avoid. They never asked. They assumed. They reacted. And they nearly destroyed something because of it. Your soulmate may then say, "You don't get to decide who I trust." That sentence marks a boundary. A healthy boundary. Because even when people believe they're protecting someone, they cannot control another person's relationships. Everyone has the right to choose who they trust. And perhaps this confrontation finally ends the manipulation. The person who tried to push you out realizes they have lost control. Not because you defeated them. Because you refused to participate in the drama. That is an important difference. You don't have to win a fight you never entered. Sometimes peace is the victory. Sometimes walking away is the victory. Sometimes letting people reveal themselves is the victory. And perhaps that's what you do. You stop chasing explanations. You stop checking who said what. You stop trying to convince everyone. You focus on your own life. And ironically, that's when everything starts changing. People begin noticing your absence from the drama. They notice you aren't retaliating. They notice you aren't spreading rumors. They notice you aren't attacking the person who attacked you. And they start asking themselves, maybe we judged them too quickly. That's how reputations are rebuilt. Not through endless explanations. Through consistent behavior. Maybe the person who tried to push you out eventually approaches you alone. Their voice is different now. Less confident. More vulnerable. They say, I was wrong. You don't immediately respond. They continue. I thought I knew who you were. I didn't. I believe things I shouldn't have believed. And I hurt you because of it. Then comes the hardest part. They say, I'm sorry. Now you have a choice. You don't have to pretend nothing happened. You don't have to become friends. You don't have to trust them again immediately. You can accept the apology while maintaining boundaries. That is maturity. Forgiveness doesn't mean giving someone unlimited access to you. It means refusing to let their actions control your future. Maybe you tell them, I appreciate the apology. But trust takes time. And they nod. Because they finally understand. You aren't cruel. You're simply protecting your peace. And perhaps that is what they needed to learn. You were never the enemy. You were the person they misunderstood. Your presence wasn't the threat. Their insecurity was. Your success wasn't the problem. Their comparison was. Your relationship wasn't the problem. Their fear of losing control was. And once that becomes clear, the entire situation changes. Maybe the person who tried to push you out eventually becomes one of the people who respects you most. Not because you forced them to. Because they finally saw the truth. They saw how you handled pressure. They saw how you refused to become bitter. They saw how you kept your dignity. And perhaps they realized. I tried to remove someone who never wanted to hurt me. That realization can be painful. But it can also be transformative. Because sometimes people need to confront their own behavior before they can change it. And maybe your soulmate witnesses that transformation. They see you standing calmly while everything around you changes. They see that you didn't need revenge. You didn't need to expose anyone. You didn't need to destroy anyone's reputation. You simply remained yourself. And perhaps that's when your soulmate falls even deeper in respect for you. Because character becomes most visible during conflict. Anyone can appear kind when everything is easy. But who are you when people misunderstand you? Who are you when someone speaks against you? Who are you when you have the opportunity to retaliate? Do you become cruel? Or do you remain grounded? Perhaps you choose the second path. And that choice changes the ending. Because the person who tried to push you out eventually realizes they were fighting a battle you never entered. They were trying to defeat someone who wasn't competing. They were trying to destroy someone who wasn't attacking. They were trying to remove someone who simply wanted peace. And that realization becomes their lesson. But your lesson is different. You learn that not everyone deserves access to your inner world. You learn to communicate directly. You learn to ask questions instead of assuming. You learn to recognize insecurity without absorbing it. You learn that boundaries aren't cruelty. You learn that forgiveness doesn't require forgetting. And perhaps most importantly, you learn that your worth doesn't change because someone misunderstands you. If 10 people misunderstand you, you're still you. If one person believes in you, you're still you. If everyone applauds, you're still you. If nobody notices, you're still you. Your identity cannot depend on the opinions of people who don't know your heart. And perhaps that's the deepest message hidden inside this story. Someone may try to push you out. But they cannot push you out of your own future. They cannot remove your potential. They cannot erase your experiences. They cannot take away everything you've learned. They cannot stop you from becoming stronger. They can close one door. But they cannot control every door. They can misunderstand your past. But they cannot write your future. They can speak about you. But they cannot become you. And perhaps the most beautiful twist is that being pushed away from one place may eventually lead you somewhere better. Maybe the position you were trying to keep wasn't meant for you. Maybe the group you wanted acceptance from wasn't your final destination. Maybe the relationship you were protecting wasn't healthy. Maybe the door closing was actually creating space for another door to open. That's why you don't have to panic every time someone tries to remove you. Sometimes rejection is redirection. Sometimes exclusion reveals where you don't belong. Sometimes losing access to a certain environment protects you from becoming someone you don't want to be. You may not understand it immediately. But later, you may look back and say, I'm glad that door closed. Not because the rejection didn't hurt. It did. But because it forced you to find something better. Maybe you found peace. Maybe you found confidence. Maybe you found new people. Maybe you found your purpose. Maybe you found yourself. And perhaps your soulmate becomes part of that new chapter. Not because they rescued you. Because they respected your growth. They saw what happened. They learned from it. And they chose honesty. Maybe they say, I don't want us to ever become like that. You ask. Like what? Like people who assume instead of asking. Like people who let fear control them. Like people who try to control each other's lives. And you realize they are serious. They want something different. Something healthier. Something built on communication. And perhaps that's where the story finally becomes peaceful. The person who tried to push you out no longer controls the narrative. The rumors have lost their power. The misunderstandings have been addressed. The truth is visible. And you are standing exactly where you were always meant to stand. Not necessarily where you expected. Not necessarily where you originally wanted. But somewhere you can breathe. Somewhere you don't have to constantly prove yourself. Somewhere people can appreciate you without making you compete for their approval. And perhaps that's the real victory. Not defeating the person who tried to push you out. Outgrowing the need to defeat them. You don't need revenge. You need peace. You don't need everyone to understand. You need to understand yourself. You don't need to prove your worth. You need to remember it. So if this fictional story feels familiar, take the message without assuming that someone is secretly plotting against you in real life. Look for concrete evidence, communicate directly, and don't let fear turn uncertainty into certainty. If someone genuinely mistreats you, protect your boundaries and seek support from people you trust. But don't allow imagined motives to steal your peace. Because the most powerful ending is this. They tried to push you out. But you discovered you were never meant to stay where you had to beg for belonging. They tried to make you feel unwanted. But you discovered your worth doesn't depend on an invitation. They tried to make you question yourself. But you became more certain of who you are. They tried to control the story. But the truth eventually spoke for itself. And perhaps the person who started everything will someday look at you and realize. I thought I was removing a problem. But I was actually pushing someone toward their next chapter. You won't need to say anything. Your life will answer for you. Your peace will answer. Your growth will answer. Your happiness will answer. And your silence will say what words never could. You never had the power to decide where my story ends. So lift your head. Protect your peace. Stay honest. Stay grounded. Don't chase people who deliberately exclude you. Don't fight every rumor. Don't allow someone else's insecurity to become your identity. And if someone truly wants you out of their life, let them make that choice. Because sometimes the space they create becomes the exact space you need to grow. Maybe the door closes. Maybe it hurts. Maybe you cry. Maybe you wonder why. But one day, you may stand on the other side of that chapter and finally understand. You weren't being destroyed. You were being redirected. You weren't being forgotten. You were being released. You weren't losing your place. You were discovering a better one. And the person who tried to push you out may eventually realize the cruelest irony of all. They thought they were removing you from the story. But they were only helping you turn the page. And when you turn that page, don't look back with hatred. Look back with gratitude for the lesson. Then keep walking. Because your next chapter doesn't need their permission. Your future doesn't need their approval. And your peace is no longer available for negotiation.